"Pretend you're my wife," my millionaire boss said. And as a cook, I said yes. That was the exact moment everything I thought I knew about my place in this world was altered forever. I never expected the night to unfold the way it did. The laughter, the whispered secrets, the weight of a single lie pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Maybe you're cooking for someone who never says thank you, or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I promise today's story will move you. The sun was just starting to rise over the Chicago skyline when I slipped into the mansion's kitchen that morning in October. The cool marble under my worn shoes felt familiar, like an old friend who'd seen too many of my tears. I tied my threadbare apron around my waist, the fabric soft from countless washes, countless mornings just like this one. The smell of coffee was already brewing. I'd started it at 5:30 before anyone else stirred in this grand house that never felt like home to me. My name is Margaret. I'm 63 years old and I've been invisible for most of them. Standing there in that pristine kitchen, surrounded by stainless steel appliances that cost more than most people's cars, I pressed my palms against the cool granite countertop and closed my eyes for just a moment. Outside, Chicago was waking up. The city sounds drifted through the tall windows. Distant traffic, the rumble of the L train, the familiar rhythm of a world that kept moving whether you were part of it or not. I opened my eyes and got to work. This was my sanctuary, my battlefield, my prison, and my refuge all at once. For 15 years, I'd poured my heart into every meal I prepared in this kitchen. 15 years of arriving before dawn and leaving after dark. 15 years of watching a family live their lives while I remained in the shadows, stirring their soups and seasoning their sorrows. Mr. Richard Whitman owned this house. Owns it, I should say. He's very much alive, though sometimes I wondered if he had a heart beating in that chest of his. 48 years old, silver at his temples, and worth more money than I could count. His fortune came from real estate investments and stock market gains that multiplied like rabbits in spring. I'd heard him on phone calls talking about millions of dollars the way I talked about pounds of flour, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, dividends, words that floated through this house like expensive perfume, meaningless to someone like me who counted every penny twice. But that morning, something was different. I could feel it in the air, the way you can sense a storm coming long before the first raindrop falls. I was kneading dough for his favorite dinner rolls when I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate. Mr. Whitman always walked like he owned not just the floor beneath his feet, but the very air around it. I kept my eyes on my work, my hands working the dough with practiced rhythm. Fold, press, turn, fold, press, turn. The same motion I'd done thousands of times, a meditation that kept me sane in this house where I was seen but never truly noticed. Margaret. His voice made me flinch, though I tried not to show it. In 15 years. He'd maybe spoken my name 100 times. Usually it was just the cook or she when he referred to me to others, as if I didn't have a name, didn't have a life outside these walls. Yes, Mr. Whitman. I kept kneading, my voice steady despite the way my heart picked up speed. He stepped into the kitchen, and I could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He was dressed in one of his perfectly tailored suits, navy blue with thin pinstripes. His shoes were polished to a shine that could blind you. I need to ask you something. He paused, and in that silence, I could hear the coffee maker gurgling, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a garbage truck rumbling down the street. Something unusual. I looked up then, flour on my hands, a strand of gray hair escaping from the neat bun I wore every day. His eyes were the color of winter sky, cold and distant. In 15 years, I don't think I'd ever seen them warm. Tonight, I'm hosting a business dinner. Potential investors for a new development project downtown, the kind of people who control millions in assets. He adjusted his tie, a small gesture that told me he was nervous about something. Richard Whitman, nervous. I'd never seen it before. "Yes, sir. What would you like me to prepare?" "That's not—" He stopped, ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "The thing is, one of the investors is bringing his wife. And he's old-fashioned, believes in traditional family values. He's uncomfortable doing business with unmarried men." I waited, my hands still in the dough, not understanding where this was going. "My wife left 2 years ago." The words came out flat, emotionless, as if he were reciting stock prices instead of talking about the end of his marriage. "Took half my liquid assets in the divorce settlement. But these investors don't know that. They think I'm still married." The dough was getting tough under my hands, overworked, but I couldn't stop kneading. It was the only thing keeping me grounded as I tried to understand what he was telling me. "I need a wife for tonight." He said it like he was ordering groceries. "Just for a few hours. Someone to play the role, sit beside me, smile at the right moments. The deal I'm negotiating could net me $20 million in profits over the next 5 years. My hands stilled. $20 million. I couldn't even imagine that much money. It was more than I'd see in 10 lifetimes of cooking in other people's kitchens. "I don't understand, Mr. Whitman. I'm asking you to pretend to be my wife tonight." He said it quickly, as if the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Just for the dinner. You know this house, you know how I like things. You're presentable enough if we get you proper clothes." Presentable enough. The words hit me like a slap. 15 years of perfect meals, of keeping his house running smoothly, of being the invisible woman who made his life comfortable, and I was presentable enough to play act being his wife for one night. "Sir, I don't think—" "I'll pay you." He cut me off. $5,000 cash for one evening. $5,000. My breath caught in my throat. That was 4 months of my salary, 4 months of groceries, of rent payments, of the tiny amounts I managed to save each month for the retirement I wasn't sure would ever come. Money that could fix the leak in my apartment ceiling, replace my worn-out winter coat, maybe even let me visit my sister in Milwaukee for the first time in 3 years. "You want me to pretend to be your wife," I said slowly, making sure I understood, "to lie to these business partners. It's not lying, it's presenting a certain image. Wives are part of the package for men like them. They need to see stability, traditional values, a man who can maintain a marriage, maintain a household." He gestured around the pristine kitchen. "You've been maintaining this household for 15 years. That was true. I had been. While he focused on his investments and stock portfolios and cryptocurrency trades, I'd been the one making sure his world ran smoothly. I'd been the one who remembered which brand of coffee he preferred, who knew he liked his eggs over easy but not too runny, who made sure his shirts were pressed and his meals were waiting when he wanted them. What about the investors' wives? Won't they ask questions? Won't they wonder why they've never met me before? I'll tell them you've been traveling, visiting family, that you're very private, don't like the spotlight." He was already crafting the story. I could see it in his eyes. "You just need to smile, nod when appropriate, maybe mention how proud you are of my work." Proud. The word nearly made me laugh, but there was nothing funny about any of this. Proud of a man who'd never once thanked me for a meal, never acknowledged the work I did to make his life possible. A man who saw me as presentable enough to pretend to be his wife, but not worthy enough to treat with basic respect any other day of the year. "I've already called a styling service," he continued. "They'll be here this afternoon to get you ready. Hair, makeup, a proper dress, everything you need." Everything I need. As if I were a doll he was dressing up for his amusement. As if my own clothes, my own appearance, my own way of being in the world wasn't good enough for his business associates, but was perfectly fine for scrubbing his floors and cooking his food. Why me? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Why not hire an actress? Someone professional? For the first time since he'd walked into the kitchen, he looked uncomfortable. His jaw tightened, and he glanced away from me, toward the window where Chicago stretched out in all its morning glory. "Because you know me," he said finally. "You know how I take my coffee, what foods I like, how I prefer things done. An actress would have to learn all of that. You already live it. You already live it." There it was, the truth laid bare. I didn't just work in his house, I lived his preferences every single day. I knew that he liked his toast dark but not burned, that he read the financial section of the Tribune first every morning, that he got quiet and moody when the stock market dropped. I knew these things because I'd been invisible in his life for so long that I'd absorbed them by osmosis, the way you absorb the smell of coffee when you work in a cafe. I looked down at my hands, still covered in flour, still holding the dough that I'd kneaded into submission. These hands had prepared thousands of meals for this man. These hands had cleaned his dishes, folded his laundry, wiped down his counters. These hands had work written into every line and callus, a lifetime of service that he was now asking me to pretend had been given out of love instead of necessity. $5,000. "What time?" I heard myself ask. Something that might have been relief flickered across his face. "The dinner starts at 7. I'll need you ready by 6:30. I nodded, not trusting my voice, not trusting myself to ask the questions that were burning inside me. What would happen after tonight? Would he go back to barely acknowledging my existence? Would he remember that for one evening I'd been important enough to sit beside him at his own table? "Good." He straightened his tie again, back to being the composed businessman. "The styling team will be here at 2. Don't eat lunch. They'll want to make sure the dress fits properly." Don't eat lunch, as if I were livestock being prepared for market, as if one meal would somehow ruin his perfect image. He turned to leave, then paused at the kitchen doorway. "Margaret?" "Yes, sir?" "This stays between us. After tonight, we never speak of it again." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the smell of coffee and the weight of what I'd just agreed to do. I looked down at the dough in my hands, overworked now, tough and resistant, ruined by too much handling, too much pressure. I threw it in the trash and started over. The rest of the morning passed in a strange haze. I went through my usual routine, preparing Mr. Whitman's breakfast, tidying the already spotless kitchen, planning the evening's menu for a dinner I would now be attending instead of serving. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 15 years, I'd stood in this kitchen while he entertained guests in the dining room. Tonight, I'd sit at that table while someone else, a catered service, he'd told me, handled the food. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I'd changed out of my work dress into my best clothes, a simple navy skirt and white blouse that I'd bought 3 years ago for my nephew's wedding. Looking at myself in the hallway mirror, I saw what Mr. Whitman saw, a woman who was presentable enough with some help. The styling team was 3 people, a woman about my age with silver hair and kind eyes, a younger man with carefully sculpted facial hair who looked at me like I was a puzzle he was excited to solve, and a quiet girl who couldn't have been more than 25, carrying what looked like an entire department store in garment bags. "You must be Margaret," the older woman said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Patricia. This is James and Sophia. We're here to make magic happen." Magic? I almost laughed. If only they knew what kind of magic this really was, the kind that turns an invisible cook into a millionaire's wife with nothing more than makeup and expensive clothes. They set up in the guest bedroom upstairs, the one with the best lighting and the large vanity mirror. I sat in an ornate chair while they worked around me, talking about me as if I weren't there. It reminded me of being in the kitchen during dinner parties, present but invisible, necessary but unacknowledged. "Her bone structure is lovely," James murmured, tilting my chin toward the light. "Classic features. We just need to bring them out. The gray in her hair is beautiful, Patricia added, running her fingers through what I'd always considered my greatest sign of age. We'll work with it, not against it. Elegant, sophisticated. Sophia was laying out dresses on the bed, more expensive-looking clothes than I'd ever seen up close, let alone worn, silks and satins in colors I'd never dared choose for myself, deep emerald, rich burgundy, midnight blue. Mr. Whitman mentioned she should look like a wealthy man's wife, Patricia said, examining the dresses, conservative but stylish. Someone who lunches with other millionaires' wives but doesn't overshadow her husband. Even in pretend, even for one night, I was supposed to remain in the background. But this time, at least, I'd be visible while I did it. They worked on me for 3 hours. 3 hours of sitting still while strangers transformed me into someone I didn't recognize. James did my makeup, his hands gentle as he applied concealer under my eyes, foundation that evened out my weathered skin, colors that made my brown eyes look larger, more expressive. Patricia worked on my hair, teasing and styling until my simple gray locks became something elegant, sophisticated. Sophia held up dresses, considered each one against my skin, finally settling on a dress in deep forest green silk that fit me like it had been made for my body. It was simple but expensive looking, with 3/4 sleeves and a neckline that was modest but flattering, the kind of dress a millionaire's wife might wear to a business dinner, elegant but not attention-grabbing. When they were finished, they turned me toward the full-length mirror in the corner of the room. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She was polished, refined, beautiful, in a way I'd forgotten I could be. The lines around her eyes looked like wisdom instead of weariness. The silver in her hair looked like elegance instead of age. The dress made her look like she belonged in this house, like she had every right to sit at the mahogany dining table instead of serving food on it. "Oh my," I whispered, reaching up to touch my cheek. "You look stunning," Patricia said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. Absolutely stunning. James was packing up his makeup kit, but he paused to look at me. You know, I've styled a lot of women over the years, wives of CEOs, politicians, celebrities, and I have to say, you have something most of them don't. What's that? Grace. Real grace. It can't be bought or taught. You either have it or you don't. He smiled at me. You have it. Grace. I'd never thought of myself as graceful. Efficient, maybe. Reliable. But not graceful. Sophia was hanging the other dresses back in their garment bags, but she stopped to squeeze my hand. "You look like a queen," she said softly. "Don't let anyone tell you different." After they left, I stood alone in the guest bedroom, staring at myself in the mirror. Somewhere in the house, I could hear Mr. Whitman on a phone call, his voice carrying through the walls as he discussed profit margins and investment returns. In a few hours, I would sit beside him at dinner and pretend to be proud of those conversations, pretend to share in his success. But for now, for just a few minutes, I let myself imagine what it would be like if this weren't pretend. What it would be like to belong in this house, to be the woman reflected in this mirror all the time, not just for one evening. At 6:15, I made my way downstairs. My heels, borrowed from Sophia, who apparently kept an emergency shoe collection in her car, clicked against the marble floors. The sound was different from my usual soft-soled work shoes, more confident somehow, more present. Mr. Whitman was waiting in the foyer, adjusting his cufflinks. He was wearing a different suit from this morning, charcoal gray with a silver tie that probably cost more than my monthly salary. When he heard my footsteps, he turned around. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe. Or recognition of something he hadn't noticed before. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "You look." He paused, searching for words. Appropriate. Appropriate. Not beautiful, not elegant, not even nice. Appropriate. Like a piece of furniture that matched the decor. "The Hendersons will be here in 10 minutes, he said, all business now. Robert Henderson owns half the commercial real estate in downtown Chicago. His wife, Catherine, is very traditional, very focused on family values. They'll expect us to be affectionate. Not overly so, but comfortable with each other. Comfortable with each other. I almost laughed. We were many things, Mr. Whitman and I, but comfortable wasn't one of them. How long have we been married? I asked, trying to get into character for this role I'd never auditioned for. 12 years, he said without hesitation. He'd thought this through. We met through mutual friends. You used to work in, let's say, interior design. That would explain your knowledge of the house, your eye for detail. Interior design. I suppose that was better than saying I used to scrub his floors and cook his meals. Any children? Something dark flashed across his face. No, we couldn't have children. There was pain in those words. Real pain. I remembered his ex-wife, Sarah. I'd barely seen her during my 15 years here. She spent most of her time traveling, shopping, anything that kept her out of this house. But I remembered the way she used to look sometimes, sad and distant, staring out the windows like she was trapped behind glass. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. He looked at me sharply, as if surprised by the genuine sympathy in my voice. For a moment, his carefully controlled expression slipped, and I saw something vulnerable underneath, something human. The doorbell rang. "Showtime," he murmured, and I saw him transform before my eyes. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by the confident smile of a successful businessman. He offered me his arm, and after a moment of hesitation, I took it. His arm was solid under my hand, warm through the expensive fabric of his jacket. It had been so long since I'd touched another person with anything approaching intimacy, even this fake version. My husband had left 8 years ago, and since then, the most human contact I'd had was the occasional handshake or pat on the shoulder from my sister during her rare visits. We walked to the front door together, our footsteps echoing in the grand foyer. Mr. Whitman opened the door with one hand, his other arm still supporting mine, and smiled the kind of smile I'd seen him use on business calls. "Robert, Catherine, so wonderful to see you both." Robert Henderson was a large man with a hearty laugh and a firm handshake. He looked like he'd played football in college and still carried himself like he could tackle anyone who got in his way. His wife, Catherine, was petite and perfectly put together, the kind of woman who'd never had a hair out of place or served her own dinner. "And this must be Margaret," Catherine said, extending a gloved hand. "Richard has told us so much about you." "Has he?" I wondered what possible stories he could have invented about me. But I smiled and shook her hand, feeling the lie settle around us like an expensive coat. "Please come in," Mr. Whitman said, guiding us toward the living room where I'd never sat, only dusted. "Can I get you both a drink?" We settled into the leather furniture that I polished twice a week, and I tried to sit the way I imagined a millionaire's wife would sit. Back straight, legs crossed at the ankle, hands folded in my lap. Catherine was watching me with the kind of sharp attention women use when they're sizing up other women. "This house is absolutely gorgeous," she said. "You must tell me who did your interior design work." Mr. Whitman and I exchanged a quick glance. "Actually, Margaret has quite an eye for these things," he said smoothly. "She did most of the work herself." "Really?" Catherine's eyebrows rose. How wonderful to have such a talented wife. So many women these days have no domestic skills at all. Domestic skills. If only she knew how many domestic skills I really had. How many floors I'd scrubbed, how many meals I'd cooked, how many hours I'd spent making this house beautiful for a man who'd never once thanked me for it. "I enjoy making our home comfortable," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. I did take pride in my work, even if the man who benefited from it had never noticed. Robert was examining the artwork on the walls, nodding approvingly. "Beautiful pieces. You've got good taste, Richard, in art and in women." He raised his glass to me, and I felt my cheeks warm. The catering staff arrived then. Three people who looked surprisingly like I had that morning, invisible and efficient as they set up the dining room. I watched them work and felt a strange disconnection from my real life. Was this what it was like to be on the other side? To sit in comfort while other people did the work that made your life possible? When we moved to the dining room, Mr. Whitman pulled out my chair for me. His hand brushed my shoulder as I sat down, and I had to remind myself it was all for show. Even so, I couldn't remember the last time someone had pulled out a chair for me. Probably not since my wedding day, 34 years ago, to a man who'd convinced me I wasn't worth much, but was lucky he'd chosen me anyway. The dinner conversation flowed around me like a river I was trying not to drown in. Talk of investments and stock portfolios, of cryptocurrency holdings and real estate developments that would reshape Chicago's skyline. Numbers that made my head spin. Millions and tens of millions discussed as casually as I might discuss the price of groceries. The downtown project could yield returns of 15 to 20% annually, Robert was saying, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. With the right investors, we're looking at profits in the hundreds of millions over the next decade. The blockchain technology alone is worth the investment, Mr. Whitman replied. Bitcoin values have stabilized, and the smart money is moving into real estate-backed cryptocurrency ventures. I nodded when they looked at me, smiled when appropriate, murmured agreement when asked direct questions. This is what tonight was about. Me being the perfect decoration for Mr. Whitman's business deal, a wife-shaped accessory that made him look stable and trustworthy to potential investors. But as the evening wore on, something strange started happening. Catherine began directing more of her conversation toward me, asking about my thoughts on Chicago, on the neighborhood changes, on the challenges of being married to such a driven businessman. It must be difficult, she said during the main course, her voice sympathetic. All the long hours, the travel, the phone calls that interrupt dinner. How do you handle it? For a moment, I was at a loss. How did a millionaire's wife handle these things? But then I realized I did know. I'd been handling them for 15 years, just from a different angle. You learn to appreciate the quiet moments, I said slowly. The early mornings before the phone starts ringing, the late evenings when the work is finally done. There's peace in those spaces between the business. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. Yes, exactly. People think wealth makes everything easier, but it just changes the nature of the problems. You still have to work at a marriage, still have to find time for each other. Mr. Whitman was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite surprise, but something close to it. As if he were hearing me speak for the first time. Really speak, instead of just responding to instructions and requests. Margaret has always been my anchor, he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost genuine. She keeps me grounded when the business world tries to sweep me away. Anchor. It was a prettier word than servant, but it meant the same thing. Something that keeps you in place. Something you rely on but rarely think about until you need it. That's the mark of a strong marriage, Robert said, raising his glass. Partners who complement each other, who bring out the best in each other. Here's to Richard and Margaret. May you have many more years of happiness together. We all raised our glasses, and I felt the weight of the lie pressing down on me. Here's to many more years of me cooking your food and cleaning your house while remaining invisible, I thought. Here's to the partnership where one person does all the work and the other gets all the credit. But I smiled and sipped my wine, a vintage that probably cost more than I spent on food in a month, and played my part. After dinner, we moved to the library for coffee and brandy. Catherine and I sat on the burgundy leather sofa while the men discussed the finer points of their business deal. She was telling me about her charity work, about the difficulties of organizing fundraisers for the symphony and the art museum. The problem is finding people who understand the commitment involved, she was saying. So many women today just want to write a check and walk away. They don't understand that real philanthropy requires hands-on involvement. Hands-on involvement. I almost choked on my coffee. I'd been doing hands-on involvement my entire life, just not the kind that came with charity galas and tax write-offs. "What causes are you involved with?" she asked me. I panicked for a moment. What would a millionaire's wife care about? What kind of charity work would someone like Margaret Whitman do? I work with food insecurity programs, I heard myself say. There are so many people in Chicago who don't know where their next meal is coming from. I believe everyone deserves to eat well, to have access to good, nutritious food. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did care about that deeply. I'd grown up poor, knew what it was like to go to bed hungry, to make a can of soup stretch for 2 days. Even now, with a steady job, I was always aware of how thin the line was between security and desperation. "How wonderful," Catherine said, and her interest seemed genuine. "That's such important work. So many people don't realize how prevalent hunger is, even in a city like Chicago." "Food is love," I said, surprising myself with the passion in my voice. When you feed someone, you're not just giving them sustenance. You're telling them they matter, they're worth caring for. A good meal can change someone's entire day, their entire outlook. Mr. Whitman had gone quiet in his conversation with Robert, and I realized he was listening to me. Really listening, maybe for the first time in 15 years. "That's beautifully put," Catherine said. "You should speak at our next auxiliary meeting. We're always looking for people who can articulate why this work matters." Before I could figure out how to respond to that, Robert stood up and clapped his hands together. "Well, Richard, I think we've covered everything we need to cover tonight. Catherine, darling, we should let these lovely people get some rest." The evening was ending. In a few minutes they would leave, and I would go back to being the cook. The expensive dress would go back to the rental company, the makeup would be washed off, and tomorrow morning I would be back in my apron, invisible again. We said our goodbyes at the front door. Catherine hugged me, and told me how lovely it had been to meet me. Robert shook Mr. Whitman's hand and said he looked forward to moving forward with their partnership. "You'll have the paperwork by Friday," he promised. "This is going to be a very profitable venture for all of us." $20 million in profits. The number seemed even more incomprehensible now that I'd sat through the dinner that would make it possible. All that money, all that success, built on a foundation of lies and appearances. After they left, Mr. Whitman and I stood in the foyer, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, each sound echoing through the house. "Well," he said finally, "that went well." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Now that it was over, the full weight of what I'd done was settling on me. I'd lied to those people. I'd helped him deceive potential business partners. I'd pretended to be something I wasn't, someone I could never be. "The money will be in your account by tomorrow," he said, already moving toward his study. "Business completed, transaction finished." "Mr. Whitman." The words came out before I could stop them. He turned back, one hand on the study door. "Yes? Did you mean what you said? About me being your anchor?" For a long moment, he just looked at me. In the soft light of the foyer, with his business mask slipping, he looked older, tired, almost vulnerable. He started, then stopped. "You've been here a long time, Margaret. This house runs smoothly because of you. I suppose I've taken that for granted." Taken that for granted. 15 years of my life, taken for granted. 15 years of meals cooked and floors cleaned and laundry folded, taken for granted. 15 years of being the invisible woman who made his life possible, taken for granted. "Good night, Mr. Whitman," I said quietly. "Good night." He disappeared into his study, and I heard the door close with a soft click. I stood there for a moment longer, still in my beautiful borrowed dress, still wearing makeup that made me look like someone else. Then I walked upstairs to the guest bedroom and began the process of becoming invisible again. The next morning, I woke up in my own small apartment for the first time in 24 hours. Sunlight was streaming through the thin curtains, and I could hear my neighbor's television through the wall. The smell of coffee was coming from somewhere, maybe my own kitchen timer, set to brew automatically as it had every morning for years. I lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling. Last night felt like a dream, something that had happened to someone else. But when I looked at my hands, I could still see traces of the elegant nail polish James had applied, and my hair was still styled in the sophisticated twist Patricia had created. In the bathroom mirror, even without makeup, I could see echoes of the woman I'd been for one evening. The bones of my face were the same, the lines around my eyes unchanged. But there was something different in my expression, something I couldn't quite name. My phone buzzed with a text message. I almost never got texts. Who would text the invisible cook? But when I looked at the screen, it was from a number I didn't recognize. "Margaret, this is Catherine Henderson. I got your number from Richard. I meant what I said about speaking at our auxiliary meeting. We meet next Thursday at 10 a.m. at the Chicago Club downtown. Would you be interested? The topic is food insecurity in urban communities." I sat down hard on my bed, staring at the message. Catherine Henderson wanted me to speak at her charity meeting. Me, Margaret the cook, not Margaret the pretend millionaire's wife, although she didn't know there was a difference. But maybe there wasn't as much difference as I'd thought. Last night, when I'd talked about food being love, when I'd spoken about the importance of feeding people who were hungry, that hadn't been the pretend Margaret talking. That had been me, the real me. The woman who'd been cooking with love for 63 years, even when that love wasn't acknowledged or returned. I typed back, "I would be honored to speak. Thank you for thinking of me." The response came quickly. "Wonderful. Dress as business casual. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this important issue." Business casual. I laughed out loud in my empty apartment. Yesterday I'd worn silk and diamonds. Today I'd be back to my work clothes and worn shoes. But somewhere in between, maybe I'd found something that belonged to me. A voice, a purpose, a way of being seen that didn't depend on pretending to be someone else's wife. When I arrived at work that morning, Mr. Whitman was already gone. There was a note on the kitchen counter in his neat handwriting. "Usual schedule today. Meeting with Henderson at 2 p.m. to finalize contract. MW." MW, even his initials were efficient, businesslike. No mention of last night, no acknowledgement of what I'd done for him. It was as if the evening had never happened, as if Margaret the wife had simply evaporated with the dawn, leaving only Margaret the cook behind. But as I tied my apron and began preparing his breakfast, I found myself humming. I couldn't remember the last time I'd hummed while I worked. The melody was something I'd heard long ago. Maybe something my mother used to sing when she cooked for our family in the tiny kitchen of our South Side apartment. My phone rang as I was scrambling eggs. The caller ID showed my sister Linda's name. "Hello, stranger," she said when I answered. "I was just thinking about you. How are things in the big house?" Linda was 3 years younger than me and had always been the successful one. She'd married well, lived in a suburb with good schools and manicured lawns. Her biggest worry was whether to vacation in Florida or California each winter. She meant well, but sometimes talking to her made me feel even more invisible than I already was. "Different," I said, flipping the eggs with more confidence than usual. "Things are different." "Different how? Did Mr. Moneybags finally give you a raise?" Something like that. I couldn't tell her the truth, could never tell anyone the truth about last night. But something had changed, something I was still trying to understand myself. "Well, whatever it is, you sound, I don't know, happier? More like yourself?" More like myself. That was interesting, because last night I'd been trying to be anyone but myself. But maybe in pretending to be Margaret Whitman, Millionaire's wife, I discovered something about Margaret, the woman that I'd forgotten was there. "I'm thinking about doing some volunteer work," I told her. "Speaking to groups about food insecurity, maybe getting involved with some local charities." "Margaret, that's wonderful. You know so much about cooking, about feeding people. You should share that knowledge." After we hung up, I finished preparing Mr. Whitman's breakfast and set it on the table in the breakfast nook, the same way I'd done thousands of times before. But today, instead of retreating to the kitchen while he ate, I found myself curious about something. I walked to the dining room where we'd sat last night. In the daylight, it looked different. Still elegant, still expensive, but somehow smaller, less intimidating. The chair I'd sat in was pushed properly under the table, no evidence remaining of the evening when I'd belonged there. 6 months earlier, this room had been redecorated. I'd watched the designers come and go, discussing color palettes and fabric choices with Sarah, his ex-wife. They'd never asked my opinion, though I was the one who would be cleaning and maintaining everything they chose. But last night, when Catherine had complimented the interior design, I'd felt a flush of pride. I did keep this room beautiful. I did know which flowers looked best in the crystal vases, which lighting made the artwork glow. The eggs are getting cold. I jumped at the sound of Mr. Whitman's voice behind me. He was standing in the doorway, still in his robe, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Sorry, sir, I was just—" What? Remembering what it felt like to belong here? Wondering if the woman who'd sat in that chair last night was more real than the one standing here now? Just what? Nothing. I'll get back to work. But he didn't move aside to let me pass. Instead, he walked into the dining room and sat down in the chair he'd occupied last night, the chair beside mine. "Sit down, Margaret." I froze. In 15 years. He'd never asked me to sit down anywhere in his house except for one brief conversation when he'd hired me. I was the help. The help didn't sit down in the dining room. "Sir, sit down. Please, please," he'd said please. I pulled out the chair I'd sat in last night and perched on the edge of it, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. "Last night went very well," he said. "Henderson signed the contract this morning. The deal is done." I nodded. "I'm glad." $22 million in profits over 5 years, maybe more if the cryptocurrency investments pay off the way we expect them to. $22 million. He'd gained $2 million just since last night, numbers that were still impossible for me to truly comprehend. "You played your part well," he continued, "very convincing. Henderson's wife was particularly impressed with you." Convinced by what? By my knowledge of how to keep a house running? By my genuine concern for hungry people? By the fact that I could sit still and smile and not embarrass him in front of his business associates? There's something else. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Henderson called me this morning, not about the business deal. That was finalized by email. He called to tell me how lucky I am to have such a thoughtful, articulate wife." My cheeks warmed. "I see." "He said Catherine is still talking about your conversation, about food insecurity, about the importance of feeding people with dignity. She wants to involve you in some charity work. She texted me this morning. She's asked me to speak at a meeting next week." Something flickered across his face. Surprise. Maybe. Or concern. "What did you tell her?" I said yes. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Chicago was coming alive. Traffic sounds, the distant rumble of the L train, the ordinary noise of a city full of people going about their lives. People who worked and hoped and struggled and dreamed. People whose names would never be on business contracts worth $22 million. "The thing is," Mr. Whitman said slowly, "Catherine thinks you're my wife. If you speak at her charity meeting, if you get involved with her social circle, you'll have to continue pretending. Pretending." The word hung in the air between us like smoke. "You mean lying?" I said quietly. "I mean maintaining a certain image. For both our benefits. These are wealthy, influential people, Margaret. The kind of people who could open doors for you that would otherwise remain closed forever. Open doors. What doors could possibly be opened for a 63-year-old cook with a high school education and hands that showed every year of physical labor? What are you suggesting?" He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the polished wood of the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. I'm suggesting that maybe this arrangement could be mutually beneficial on occasion. When I need a wife for social or business functions, when you want access to the kind of social circles that could further your charity work. A business arrangement, that's what he was offering. Not friendship, not respect, and certainly not anything real. Just an extension of what I already was, someone who made his life more convenient, more comfortable, more successful. And in between those occasions, everything stays the same. Everything stays the same. I would go back to being invisible, go back to cooking his meals and cleaning his house and existing in the margins of his life. But sometimes, when it served his purposes, I would be temporarily upgraded to wife status, a part-time promotion with no real change in pay or position. I need to think about it, I said. He nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. But as I stood up to leave, he spoke again. Margaret? Yes? Last night. What you said about food being love, about everyone deserving to eat well. Did you mean that, or were you just playing a part? The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like genuine curiosity, as if my opinion might actually matter to him. I meant it, I said. I've meant it every day for 15 years. He nodded slowly. I thought so. I walked back to the kitchen, my mind spinning. In the space of 24 hours, my entire world had shifted. Yesterday morning, I'd been Margaret the invisible cook. Last night, I'd been Margaret the millionaire's wife. This morning, I was something in between, a woman who existed in the spaces between other people's definitions of who she should be. The next week passed in a strange haze of normalcy. I went through my usual routines, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the beautiful house that belonged to someone else. But underneath the familiar rhythms of my work, something was changing. I found myself paying attention to things I'd always ignored before. The way morning light fell across the dining room table, the satisfaction of arranging fresh flowers in ways that brought color and life to expensive but cold spaces. I also found myself thinking about Catherine Henderson's invitation. Every morning when I woke up, I wondered if I would really go through with it. What would I say to a room full of wealthy charity ladies? What could someone like me possibly contribute to their conversations about helping the less fortunate? But Thursday morning came, and I found myself standing in front of my closet, trying to decide what business casual meant for someone who owned 3 work dresses and 1 good outfit for church. In the end, I chose my navy skirt and white blouse again, the same clothes I'd worn when the styling team transformed me into someone else. Without the professional hair and makeup, without the borrowed jewelry and expensive dress, I looked like what I was, a working woman trying to belong in a place she'd never been invited before. The Chicago Club was downtown, in one of those buildings that screamed old money and established power. I'd walked past it hundreds of times over the years. It was only a few blocks from the grocery store where I shopped for Mr. Whitman's specialty items. But I'd never imagined actually going inside. The lobby was all marble and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where every footstep echoed with importance. I approached the reception desk, my hands shaking slightly. "I'm here for the Women's Auxiliary Meeting," I told the perfectly groomed young woman behind the desk. "I'm Margaret Whitman." The lie slipped out so easily I almost surprised myself. But it wasn't really a lie anymore, was it? For one evening, I had been Margaret Whitman. Today, I was something in between, not quite the cook, not quite the wife, but a woman with something to say. "Of course, Mrs. Whitman, the elevator to your right will take you to the 3rd floor, the Hamilton Room." The Hamilton Room was elegant in the way that old money always was, understated but expensive, comfortable but formal. About 20 women were seated around a large conference table, all of them perfectly put together in ways I was still learning to recognize. Their clothes were well tailored, their hair professionally styled, their jewelry real. They looked like they'd never doubted their right to be in rooms like this. Catherine Henderson rose when she saw me and came over with a warm smile. "Margaret, I'm so glad you could make it. Everyone is eager to hear what you have to say." She introduced me to the other women, names and titles that blurred together in my nervousness. Mrs. Adams, whose husband owned a chain of hotels. Mrs. Rodriguez, married to a prominent lawyer. Mrs. Chen, whose family had made their fortune in technology. Women whose lives were so different from mine, they might as well have been from another planet. But as Catherine introduced the topic, food insecurity in Chicago communities, I began to relax. This was something I knew about, not from charity work or academic study, but from lived experience. I knew what it meant to make beans and rice stretch for a week. I knew what it felt like to stand in a grocery store and count every dollar twice. I knew the shame of being hungry in a country that threw away tons of food every day. Margaret has graciously agreed to share her insights with us today, Catherine was saying. She's been involved with food insecurity programs for several years, and she has a unique perspective on the challenges facing our community. All eyes turned to me. 20 pairs of eyes belonging to women who'd never worried about where their next meal would come from. Women who'd never stood in line at a food bank or made their children eat cereal for dinner because it was all they could afford. I cleared my throat and began to speak. "When I was 7 years old," I said, "my father lost his job at the steel mill. It was winter in Chicago, and we didn't have money for both heat and food. My mother chose heat, figuring we could always find something to eat, but we couldn't survive freezing to death." The room went quiet. This wasn't what they'd expected to hear, I could tell. They'd expected statistics and fundraising strategies, not personal stories of poverty and hunger. For 3 weeks, we lived on oatmeal and whatever my mother could find at the day-old bread store. She would tell us she wasn't hungry, that she'd eaten earlier so there would be enough for my sister and me. Years later, I realized she hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks. I paused, looking around the table. Some of the women were leaning forward now, really listening. That's when I learned that food isn't just about nutrition. It's about dignity. It's about love. When my mother split 1 can of soup between 3 people and somehow made it feel like a feast, she was teaching us that we mattered, that even when the world seemed to have forgotten about us, we were still worthy of care. Mrs. Adams cleared her throat. "That must have been very difficult." "It was," I said, "but it also taught me something important. When you feed someone, you're not just giving them calories. You're telling them they have value. You're saying their life matters." I talked for 20 minutes about hunger in Chicago, about the families I'd known over the years who'd struggled to put food on the table, about the children who came to school with empty stomachs and tried to concentrate on learning while their bodies were crying out for nourishment. I talked about the elderly people who chose between medication and groceries, about the working families who made too much money to qualify for assistance, but too little to live comfortably. And I talked about something else, something I'd never put into words before, the invisible people who kept the world running, the cooks and cleaners and caregivers who made sure everyone else was fed and comfortable, while they themselves went unnoticed and unacknowledged. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Mrs. Rodriguez spoke up. "Margaret, that was powerful. You've given us a lot to think about." "I agree," said Catherine. "We've been approaching this issue from a distance, writing checks and organizing fundraisers, but we haven't really understood what hunger looks like, what it feels like. You've opened our eyes." After the meeting, several of the women came up to talk to me individually. They wanted to know more about the programs I'd mentioned, the organizations that were doing good work with limited resources. I found myself giving advice, sharing contacts, suggesting ways they could make their charitable giving more effective and personal. Mrs. Chen pressed a business card into my hand. "I'd like you to consult with my foundation," she said. "We're looking for someone who understands these issues from the ground up, someone who can help us direct our resources where they'll do the most good." Consult. As if my opinion had value, as if my experience was worth something beyond the meals I could prepare and the floors I could clean. As I left the Chicago Club that day, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride in who I was, not just what I could do for other people. Walking down Michigan Avenue in my simple clothes and comfortable shoes, I felt more like Margaret Whitman, Millionaire's wife, than I had in silk and diamonds. That evening, I was preparing dinner when Mr. Whitman came into the kitchen. This was unusual. He typically avoided the kitchen during food preparation, preferring to maintain the invisible boundary between the people who cooked and the people who ate. "How did your meeting go today?" he asked. I was surprised he remembered. "It went well. Very well, actually." "What did you speak about?" I glanced at him as I stirred the sauce for his chicken. He was leaning against the counter, his tie loosened, looking more relaxed than I usually saw him, almost interested. "I talked about hunger," I said, "about what it's really like to not have enough food, about the people who are invisible in our society, the ones who serve others while struggling themselves." He was quiet for a moment. That must have been difficult to talk about. It was, but it was also freeing, I suppose, to have people really listen, to feel like my experience mattered. "Your experience does matter, Margaret." I looked at him sharply. There was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Sincerity, maybe, or something approaching it. "Does it?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched me work, my hands moving with practiced efficiency as I plated his dinner. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about last week, about the dinner party, the arrangement." Here it comes, I thought. He's going to ask me to do it again. Another business dinner, another evening of pretending to be something I'm not. "I realize I never really thanked you," he said, "for what you did. It was above and beyond your job description. Above and beyond. Like staying late to cook a special meal or working on holidays when he had guests. Just another service provided by the reliable household help." "It was a business transaction," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "You paid me for a service." "Was it, though?" He moved closer to where I was working, close enough that I could smell his cologne, feel the heat from his body. "When you talked to Catherine about food insecurity, about feeding people with love, that wasn't part of the act. That was you." I set down my spoon and turned to face him. "What are you trying to say, Mr. Whitman?" "I'm trying to say that maybe I've misjudged you. Maybe I've been so focused on maintaining the boundaries between employer and employee that I've failed to see who you really are, who I really am, as if he'd just discovered I was a person with thoughts and feelings and experiences that existed beyond his kitchen, beyond his needs and preferences. And who am I, in your opinion?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the soft light of the kitchen. "You're a woman who's spent 15 years making my life comfortable while asking for nothing in return. You're someone who can speak with authority about poverty and hunger because you've lived it, not just studied it. You're—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "You're someone worth knowing." Someone worth knowing. It was such a simple phrase, but it hit me like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had thought I was worth knowing? When was the last time someone had been curious about my thoughts, my experiences, my perspective on the world? "The thing is," he continued, "I'd like to know you, the real you, not just the version of you that serves my dinner and keeps my house clean." "Why?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended. "Why now? What's changed?" He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect styling. "Honestly, I don't know. Maybe it was seeing you last week, watching you handle yourself with those people. Maybe it was realizing that in 15 years, I've never once asked about your life, your dreams, your thoughts about anything that didn't directly relate to my comfort. My dreams." I almost laughed. What dreams could a 63-year-old cook possibly have? But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't true. I did have dreams, buried so deep I'd almost forgotten they existed. dreams of cooking for people who appreciated it, of using my knowledge and experience to help others, of mattering in ways that went beyond keeping someone else's world running smoothly. What would that look like? I asked. Getting to know the real me? I don't know, he admitted. Maybe we could start by having a conversation, a real conversation where you're not serving me and I'm not paying you, where we're just two people talking. Two people. Not employer and employee, not millionaire and cook, but just two people. I should finish your dinner, I said, turning back to the stove. Margaret. He said my name softly. And I heard something in it I'd never heard before. Not the brisk efficiency of a boss giving instructions, but something warmer, more personal. I turned back to him. I know I don't have the right to ask this, he said. I know I've spent 15 years treating you like part of the furniture, but would you consider having dinner with me sometime? Not as my employee, not as part of some business pretense, but as what? As friends, maybe? Friends. The word hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Could we be friends? This man who'd ignored me for 15 years, and the woman who'd been invisible in his life for so long. Could we sit across from each other as equals when everything in our history said we were anything but? I need to think about it, I said finally. He nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. But as I finished preparing his dinner and set it on the table in the breakfast nook, I found myself wondering what it would be like to sit across from him, not as the hired help, but as a person whose opinions mattered, whose experiences had value, whose presence was wanted rather than simply tolerated. That night, alone in my apartment, I called my sister Linda. I think my life is about to change, I told her. Change how? I tried to explain without revealing too much, about the charity work, about feeling like I had something valuable to contribute to the world, about the possibility of being seen as more than just the invisible woman who cooked other people's food. Margaret, Linda said when I finished, you sound different, stronger. Like you're finally remembering who you used to be. Who I used to be. I'd been so focused on who I'd become. The reliable cook, the invisible servant, the woman who asked for nothing and expected less, that I'd forgotten who I'd been before life wore me down to essentials. I'd been Margaret Sullivan once, a young woman with dreams and opinions, and the audacity to believe she deserved more than scraps. I'd been someone who laughed easily and loved deeply and thought the world was full of possibilities. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost her. But maybe, just maybe, I was starting to find her again. The next few weeks fell into a strange new rhythm. During the day, I maintained my usual routine, cooking, cleaning, keeping Mr. Whitman's world running smoothly. But in the evenings, after I'd served his dinner and cleaned the kitchen, sometimes he would linger. Sometimes he would ask me about my day, about the charity work I was getting more involved with, about my thoughts on current events or books or the changing neighborhoods of Chicago. They were small conversations, tentative and careful. Neither of us quite knew how to navigate this new territory, but gradually I began to see glimpses of the man behind the businessman. He told me about growing up in a family where money was everything and emotions were weaknesses to be overcome. He talked about the pressure of managing investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars, about the loneliness of never knowing if people liked him for himself or for his wealth. And I found myself talking, too, about my childhood on the South Side, about my brief marriage to a man who'd made me feel small and worthless, about the dreams I'd set aside to focus on survival, about the satisfaction I found in cooking, in nurturing others, even when that nurturing went unacknowledged. "Why did you stay?" he asked one evening. 15 years is a long time to work for someone who didn't appreciate you. It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times over the years. "Where else would I go?" I said quietly. "I'm a high school graduate with no special skills, except cooking. Jobs like this one don't grow on trees. And besides, I kept hoping that maybe someday you'd notice. that maybe someday the work I did would matter to you." He was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "It always mattered, Margaret. I just didn't know how to show it. Didn't know how to show it." As if gratitude were some complex skill that required special training instead of simple human decency. But I was beginning to understand that Richard Whitman had grown up in a world where service was expected, where the people who made comfortable lives possible were as invisible as the air you breathed, essential but unacknowledged, necessary but unappreciated. It didn't excuse 15 years of being treated like furniture, but it helped me understand how we'd both gotten trapped in roles that served neither of us well. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in November. Chicago was settling into its winter rhythm, dark by 5 o'clock. Cold winds rattling the windows, the kind of weather that made you grateful for warm kitchens and hot meals. I had just finished serving Mr. Whitman's dinner when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Chen from the Women's Auxiliary. "Margaret, I hope I'm not calling too late. I have wonderful news." I stepped into the hallway to take the call, aware that Mr. Whitman could probably hear every word from the dining room. "Our foundation has received approval for a new program," Mrs. Chen continued. "Community kitchens in underserved neighborhoods, focusing not just on feeding people, but on teaching cooking skills, nutrition education, job training for food service positions. It's exactly the kind of holistic approach you've been advocating for." My heart began to race. This was the kind of program I dreamed about, the kind of work that could make a real difference in people's lives. "That's wonderful," I said. "How can I help?" "Well, that's why I'm calling. We'd like you to direct the program. Full-time position, competitive salary, benefits. You'd be in charge of curriculum development, staff hiring, community outreach. It would be a chance to put all your knowledge and experience to work in a way that could impact hundreds of families." I sank against the wall, overwhelmed. A full-time job, directing a program, using my skills and knowledge in ways that went far beyond cooking for one person who'd barely noticed me for 15 years. I started, then stopped. I need to think about it. Of course. But Margaret, I have to tell you, the board was unanimous in wanting you for this position. Your presentation at our meeting, your insights into the real needs of struggling families, your authentic understanding of what hunger looks like. That's exactly what this program needs. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at my phone. A chance to matter, to make a difference, to be valued for who I was instead of just what I could do for someone else's comfort. It would mean leaving this job, leaving this house where I'd spent 15 years of my life, leaving Mr. Whitman to find another cook, another invisible woman to keep his world running smoothly. The thought should have filled me with anxiety. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excitement about my own future. When I walked back toward the kitchen, Mr. Whitman called out to me, "Margaret, could you come here for a moment?" He was still sitting at the dining room table, his meal half finished. In the soft light from the chandelier, he looked older than his 48 years, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said. It sounded like good news. I sat down across from him, in the chair I'd occupied that night weeks ago when I'd pretended to be his wife. But this time, I wasn't pretending to be anyone except myself. "They've offered me a job," I said, "directing a community nutrition program. It would be everything I've ever wanted to do." He nodded slowly. "You're going to take it." It wasn't a question. He could see the answer in my face, in the way my voice had changed when I talked about the opportunity. "I think I am," I said. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows of this beautiful house that had been my second home for 15 years. "I'm happy for you," he said finally, and I could hear that he meant it. "You deserve this, Margaret. You deserve to be valued for everything you have to offer." "What will you do?" I asked. About the cooking, the house management? He smiled, a real smile that I'd rarely seen before. I suppose I'll have to learn to take care of myself, or hire someone, but it won't be the same. No, I agreed, it won't. When would you start? In January. They want to launch the first community kitchen in Pilsen, expand from there. January. 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to finish 15 years of service, to train whoever would replace me, to say goodbye to the life I'd known for so long. Margaret? He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. I want you to know something. These past few weeks, getting to know you, the real you, it's made me realize how much I've missed, how much we've both missed. I waited for him to continue. I've been thinking about what you said, about staying here hoping I'd notice, hoping your work would matter to me. And I want you to know that it did matter. You matter. I was just too proud, too set in my ways, too afraid of changing the dynamic to acknowledge it. Too afraid of changing the dynamic. As if treating me with basic human respect would somehow upset the natural order of his world. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I'm afraid if I don't say it now, I'll never get another chance. Because in 6 weeks, you'll be gone, and I'll be left knowing that I had 15 years to appreciate an extraordinary woman, and I wasted almost every one of them. Extraordinary. No one had ever called me extraordinary before. Richard, I said, using his first name for maybe the second time in 15 years. What are you asking? He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, there was something vulnerable in his expression that I'd never seen before. I'm asking if there's any possibility that we could try to build something real. Not employer and employee, not pretend wife and husband, but two people who found something in each other that neither of us expected. Two people who found something in each other. Is that what had been happening these past few weeks? Had I been finding something in this man who'd ignored me for so long? Maybe I had. Maybe in those evening conversations, in the way he'd started really listening when I spoke, in the gradual softening of his expression when he looked at me, I'd begun to see glimpses of someone worth knowing. But 15 years was a long time to be invisible. 15 years of being treated like hired help, of having my work taken for granted, of existing at the margins of someone else's life. Could I forget all of that? Could I trust that this newfound interest in who I really was would last beyond the novelty of discovery? I don't know, I said honestly. I don't know if I can separate who you are now from who you've been for 15 years. I don't know if I can trust that you won't go back to seeing me as the convenient woman who keeps your life organized. He nodded, accepting my honesty. I understand, and I don't blame you for feeling that way. I've given you no reason to trust me. It's not just about trust, I said. It's about respect. It's about being seen as an equal, not as someone whose value depends on what I can do for you. You're right. You're absolutely right. He pushed his plate away, his appetite apparently gone. I suppose I don't have any right to ask for more than you've already given. The conversation ended there, but it stayed with me for days. I found myself watching him differently, looking for signs of whether his newfound appreciation was genuine or just another form of self-interest. Was he really interested in me as a person, or was he just afraid of losing the convenience of having me around? Meanwhile, Mrs. Chen's job offer sat in my mind like a bright light, illuminating possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. A chance to use my knowledge and experience in ways that could help hundreds of people. A chance to be valued not for my ability to keep someone else's life running smoothly, but for my insights into hunger and nutrition and the complex needs of struggling families. A chance to matter. I gave Mr. Whitman my formal notice the following Monday morning. He accepted it gracefully, even helped me draft a job description to find my replacement. We worked together professionally, cordially, with none of the awkward tension I'd expected. But in the evenings, he continued to seek out those conversations. He asked about my plans for the new job, about the neighborhoods where the community kitchens would be located, about my vision for the program. He listened to my answers with the kind of attention I'd always craved but never received. And slowly, carefully, he began to share more about his own life, about the loneliness of wealth, about the difficulty of forming genuine relationships when everyone wanted something from you, about his failed marriage to a woman who'd married his bank account instead of his heart. Sarah was beautiful, accomplished, everything a successful man was supposed to want in a wife, he told me one evening. But she was never really there, not the way you've been there, cooking meals that tasted like someone cared, keeping the house in a way that made it feel like a home instead of just an expensive showcase, made it feel like a home. All those years, I'd thought I was just doing a job. I hadn't realized I was creating something more precious, a sense of belonging, of being cared for, even if that care came from someone who was paid to provide it. The difference, he continued, is that Sarah was performing being a wife, and you were actually being, I don't know what to call it, a caretaker, a homemaker, someone who made everything better just by being there. Someone who made everything better just by being there. It was the kind of recognition I'd waited 15 years to hear, and now that it was finally coming, part of me wondered if it was too late. 2 weeks before my last day, something happened that changed everything. I was working late, preparing meals for Mr. Whitman to freeze so he wouldn't be left completely helpless when I was gone. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and I was just putting the last casserole in the freezer when I heard voices from his study. I wasn't eavesdropping, not intentionally. But the study was right next to the kitchen, and the voices were raised in what sounded like an argument. "You told me the funds were secure," a woman's voice said. "You promised me this investment was bulletproof." "These things happen, Sarah. The cryptocurrency market is volatile. We knew there were risks." Sarah, his ex-wife, the one who'd taken half his liquid assets in the divorce. What was she doing here? Risks. Her voice rose to a near shriek. "Richard, I put my entire settlement into this venture, $2.5 million. You said it was guaranteed returns." My hand stilled on the freezer door. $2.5 million, more money than I could imagine, lost in some kind of investment gone wrong. I said it was a good bet, not a guarantee. There's a difference. Don't you dare lecture me about the difference. I trusted you, even after everything that happened between us. I trusted you with my future financial security. Sarah, please, lower your voice. I have staff in the house. Staff. Even now, even after weeks of tentative friendship, I was still just staff to him. I don't care about your staff. I care about my money, our money, the money I earned by putting up with your cold, selfish... Enough. His voice cut through her tirade like ice. The investment failed. It happens. I lost money too. You lost money you could afford to lose. I lost everything. There was a long silence. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice lower but no less venomous. "Fix this, Richard. I don't care how you do it, but you fix this. Because if I go down, I'm taking you with me. The Henderson deal, the cryptocurrency investments, the fake tax documents, I know about all of it." Fake tax documents. My blood went cold. The Henderson deal, the one I'd helped secure by pretending to be his wife, was built on lies. Not just the lie of our marriage, but deeper deceptions, financial fraud that could destroy both of them. You don't know what you're talking about. But his voice lacked conviction. Don't I? I was married to you for 6 years, Richard. I know exactly how you operate. And I have records, emails, documents, proof of every corner you've cut and every law you've bent. What do you want? I want my money back. And if you can't give it to me, I want you to make it right some other way. Because otherwise, I'm going to the FBI with everything I know. The FBI. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall, my heart hammering. Whatever I'd stumbled into, it was bigger than a failed investment. It was fraud, maybe criminal conspiracy. And I'd been part of it, helping to deceive the Hendersons, legitimizing business deals that were built on lies. I heard chair scraping, footsteps, the sound of the study door opening. Think about what I've said, Richard. You have 48 hours to come up with a solution. Her heels clicked on the marble floor as she walked toward the front door. I stayed frozen in the kitchen until I heard the door slam, until I heard Mr. Whitman's footsteps going upstairs, until the house was quiet again. Then I sat down hard in one of the kitchen chairs, trying to process what I'd just learned. The man I'd been working for, the man I'd been slowly learning to trust, was a criminal. The business deal I'd helped facilitate by pretending to be his wife was built on fraud. The fortune he'd accumulated through stock market investments and cryptocurrency trading, at least some of it was dirty money, gained through illegal means, and now his ex-wife was blackmailing him, threatening to expose everything unless he could somehow return her lost investment. I thought about the Henderson dinner, about how impressed they'd been with the stable, traditional marriage I'd helped Richard project. Had that deal gone through because of my performance? Had I helped him steal millions of dollars from people who'd trusted him? The weight of it was crushing. For 15 years, I'd cooked this man's food and cleaned his house, thinking I was just doing an honest job for honest pay. But I'd been supporting a lifestyle built on fraud, enabling a man who was stealing from others while presenting himself as a pillar of the business community. What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? Pretend I hadn't heard anything? Walk away quietly and start my new job, leaving Richard to face the consequences of his choices alone? Or was I morally obligated to do something? To report what I knew, even if it meant destroying the fragile friendship we'd been building, even if it meant admitting my own complicity in his deceptions. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what the right thing to do was. By morning, I'd made my decision. I called Mrs. Chen and told her I needed to postpone my start date by a few weeks. There were some matters I needed to resolve with my current position first. Then I went to work as usual, cooked Mr. Whitman's breakfast as usual, went through the motions of my normal routine while my mind raced with plans. When he came into the kitchen that evening, I was ready for him. "We need to talk," I said. He looked tired, older than his 48 years. The stress of Sarah's ultimatum was written in every line of his face. "Margaret, I know about Sarah. I know about the fake documents and the fraudulent investments. I heard your conversation last night." He went completely still, his face draining of color. "You were listening?" "I was working." "You were arguing loudly enough for half the neighborhood to hear?" He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, putting his head in his hands. "How much did you hear?" "Enough. Enough to know that the Henderson deal was built on lies. Enough to know that you've been committing fraud. Enough to know that I helped you do it." He looked up at me then, and I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Fear. "Margaret, please. I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why you involved me in criminal activity without my knowledge or consent? Can you explain 16 years of treating me like I was invisible while you built a fortune on stolen money? It's not that simple. Business is complicated. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to stay competitive." "Bend the rules?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Richard, your ex-wife is talking about the FBI. That's not bending rules, that's breaking laws." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I don't know. I've spent the last 24 hours trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, what I owe you, what I owe the people you've defrauded, what I owe myself. Please." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Margaret, please. If this comes out, I'll lose everything. My business, my reputation, my freedom. I could go to prison." "Maybe you should have thought about that before you started stealing from people." I never thought it would go this far. It started small, just minor adjustments to make the numbers look better. But then it snowballed, and I couldn't find a way to stop without revealing what I'd already done. The classic criminal's excuse. It started small. It snowballed, as if fraud were something that just happened to him instead of something he'd chosen to do. What about the Henderson deal, I asked. The $22 million you made because I helped convince them you were a stable, trustworthy partner? His face darkened. That deal was legitimate. The deception about our marriage doesn't invalidate the business arrangement, doesn't it? They invested with you because they believed you were someone you're not. They trusted you because I helped you lie to them. Margaret, please. You don't understand how these things work. In business, everyone presents their best face. Everyone emphasizes the positives and downplays the negatives. It's not lying, it's marketing. Marketing. That's what he called fraud now. I stood up from the table, suddenly exhausted by this conversation, by the weight of what I'd learned, by the realization that the man I'd been slowly learning to care about was not at all who I'd thought he was. I need time to think, I said. I need to decide what I'm going to do with what I know. How much time? I don't know. But Richard, if you're smart, you'll find a way to make this right. Pay back the people you've stolen from. Come clean before Sarah forces your hand. Because if you don't, someone else will make these decisions for you. I left him sitting in the kitchen, his head in his hands, looking every bit as lost as he should have. The next 2 days were among the hardest of my life. I went through the motions of my job while wrestling with an impossible decision. Turn in a man who'd treated me badly but whom I'd begun to forgive, or stay silent and become complicit in his crimes. I thought about the Henderson family, about how they'd trusted Richard partly because of the stable marriage I'd helped him project. I thought about all the other investors who might have been defrauded, who might be losing their life savings while Richard lived in luxury. And I thought about myself, about the woman I wanted to be as I started this new chapter of my life. Did I want to be someone who looked the other way when she learned about criminal activity? Someone who chose comfort and safety over doing what was right? On the third day, I made my choice. I called the FBI. The agent I spoke with was a woman around my age named Detective Martinez. She listened carefully as I told her what I knew, asked clarifying questions, explained that they'd been investigating Richard's business practices for months based on tips from other sources. "We've been looking for someone on the inside," she told me, "someone who had access to his daily activities, his communications, his behavior patterns. Would you be willing to help us gather evidence?" Help them gather evidence. Become an informant against my employer, the man who'd been paying my salary for 15 years. What would that involve? Wearing a wire during conversations with him, documenting any incriminating statements he makes, possibly testifying if the case goes to trial, testifying in court, standing up in front of a judge and jury and telling the world about Richard's crimes, about my role in helping him deceive the Hendersons, about 15 years of being invisible in a house built on stolen money. "I need to think about it," I said. "Of course, but I'm sorry, what should I call you?" "Margaret." "Margaret Sullivan." "Margaret, I want you to know that you're doing the right thing. People like Mr. Whitman think they can steal from hardworking families because they assume no one will speak up. Your willingness to come forward could help recover millions of dollars for his victims. Millions of dollars for his victims. People who'd trusted their life savings to a man who'd seen them as nothing more than sources of easy money." "I'll do it," I heard myself say. "I'll help you gather evidence." The next 3 weeks were the strangest of my life. I continued working in Richard's house, cooking his meals and managing his schedule, while wearing a small recording device taped under my shirt. I encouraged him to talk about his business, about his plans for dealing with Sarah's threats, about the various investment schemes he was running. It was easier than I'd expected. Richard was so stressed about Sarah's ultimatum, so desperate to find a solution, that he talked almost compulsively about his problems. He told me about shell companies he'd created to hide assets, about fake documents he'd used to inflate his net worth, about investors he'd deceived with promises of guaranteed returns. And he told me about his feelings for me, about how getting to know me had made him realize what he'd been missing in his life, about his hopes that we might build something real together once his current problems were resolved. Those conversations were the hardest to record. Whatever else he was, Richard was still a human being who'd shown me kindness in recent months, who'd treated me with more respect than I'd received in years. Knowing that every word he spoke was being preserved as evidence against him felt like the worst kind of betrayal. But then I'd think about the Henderson family, about the other investors who'd trusted Richard with their money, and I'd remember why I was doing this. The end came sooner than I'd expected. Sarah, growing impatient with Richard's failure to repay her lost investment, made good on her threat and contacted the FBI herself. She provided them with financial documents, email correspondences, and recorded phone calls that proved Richard's guilt beyond any doubt. Detective Martinez called me on a Thursday morning in early December. "We're moving today," she said. "The arrest warrant has been signed. We'll be at the house within the hour." Within the hour. I looked around Richard's kitchen, the place where I'd spent so many hours of my life, where I'd finally been seen and valued, where I'd learned to believe in my own worth again. Will I need to be there? If possible. We may want you to help us locate specific documents or evidence. I was still in the kitchen when they arrived, 6 FBI agents in dark suits carrying briefcases and evidence bags. Detective Martinez introduced herself and showed me her badge, though we'd already met. Richard was in his study when they knocked on the door. I heard him answer, heard the formal language of the arrest, heard the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. They brought him through the kitchen. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, perfectly tailored and elegantly cut, but the handcuffs made him look small and defeated. When he saw me standing there, watching, his face went through a series of emotions: surprise, hurt, understanding, and finally something that might have been respect. "You turned me in," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I suppose I deserved that." "Yes," I said again. "You did." They led him away then, to a car waiting outside, to a future that would probably include prison time and financial ruin. I watched from the kitchen window as they drove away, taking with them the man who'd employed me for 15 years, who'd ignored me for most of that time, and who'd finally seen me just in time to discover that being seen came with consequences. Detective Martinez stayed behind to oversee the evidence collection: boxes of financial documents, computer hard drives, phones, anything that might contain proof of Richard's crimes. "Are you all right?" she asked me as agents moved through the house, photographing and cataloging everything. "I think so," I said, though I wasn't sure it was true. "You did the right thing, Margaret. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but you did the right thing." The right thing. I wondered if it would still feel like the right thing in a year, in 5 years, when the immediate crisis had passed and I was left with the memory of the look on Richard's face when he realized I'd betrayed him. But then I thought about something else: the look on Catherine Henderson's face when she'd told me how much the charity work mattered, the excitement in Mrs. Chen's voice when she'd offered me the job directing the community nutrition program, the possibility of spending my days feeding people who were grateful for the nourishment, teaching skills that could change lives, being valued for knowledge and experience that went far beyond keeping someone else's world comfortable. Maybe Richard's arrest wasn't an ending. Maybe it was the beginning of something better. I started my new job 3 weeks later. The Chen Foundation had secured a beautiful space in Pilsen, a former restaurant with a large, well-equipped kitchen and dining area that we converted into a community nutrition center. My first day walking into that space, seeing my name on the door of the small office, meeting the staff I would supervise, it felt like stepping into a life I'd never dared to imagine I deserved. The work was everything I'd hoped it would be: We served meals to families struggling with food insecurity, but we also taught cooking classes, nutrition education, job skills training for food service positions. I found myself drawing on decades of experience, not just in cooking, but in understanding what hunger looked like, what dignity meant to people who'd been overlooked by society. The people who came to our center were a lot like I'd been, invisible to the wider world, doing essential work for little recognition, struggling to make ends meet while maintaining their self-respect. But in our kitchen, they weren't invisible. They were students and teachers, learners and experts, people whose experiences and insights mattered. 6 months after Richard's arrest, I received a letter from him. He was in federal prison, awaiting sentencing. His letter was handwritten, his usually perfect penmanship slightly shaky. "Dear Margaret," it began, "I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect you to write back. But I wanted you to know that I understand why you did what you did, and I'm grateful that you gave me the chance to make things right before Sarah forced the issue. My lawyer tells me that by cooperating with the FBI, by helping them trace the stolen funds and identify the victims, I may reduce my sentence somewhat. More importantly, they've been able to recover most of the money I stole. The Henderson family will get their investment back. So will most of the others. I want you to know that the time we spent getting to know each other these past few months was the most genuine, honest period of my adult life. You taught me what it meant to value someone for who they are rather than what they can do for you. I'm only sorry it took me 15 years to learn that lesson. I hope your new work is everything you wanted it to be. I hope you're finally getting the recognition and respect you always deserved. With sincere regret and genuine affection, Richard." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer. I never wrote back, but I kept it. Not because I'd forgiven him, I wasn't there yet, might never be, but because it reminded me of something important. People could change. People could grow. And sometimes, the most painful experiences were the ones that taught us who we really were and what we were capable of. A year later, I was invited back to speak at the Women's Auxiliary. The room was packed, not just with wealthy charity ladies, but with social workers, community activists, people who'd participated in our programs. I told them about the Community Nutrition Center, about the families we'd served, about the small miracles that happened when people were fed with dignity and respect. After my presentation, Catherine Henderson approached me. She was smiling, but there was concern in her eyes. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind my asking, but whatever happened to Richard? We haven't heard from him in months, and when we tried to contact him about our ongoing business relationship, we were told he was unavailable." I took a deep breath. This was the conversation I'd been preparing for, the moment when I would have to explain my role in exposing the man who deceived her family. "Richard is in federal prison," I said quietly. "He was convicted of investment fraud. The money he stole from your family and others has been recovered and returned." Catherine's face went pale. "Investment fraud? But how did we get our money back?" "Someone who worked in his house discovered what he was doing and reported it to the authorities." She stared at me for a long moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Someone who worked in his house?" "Yes." "Margaret, were you ever really his wife?" "No," I said. "I was his cook. For 15 years, I was his cook." I saw shock, confusion, and then something unexpected. Respect. "You were the one who turned him in?" "Yes." She was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Around us, the room continued buzzing with conversation about community programs and charitable initiatives, but Catherine and I stood in a bubble of silence. "You saved us millions of dollars," she said finally, "and you did it knowing it would cost you your job, your security, everything you'd built over 15 years. I did it because it was the right thing to do." She extended her hand to me, and I shook it. "Margaret Sullivan," she said, "you are an extraordinary woman." Extraordinary. The same word Richard had used, but this time it felt different. This time it felt earned. That night, I went home to my small apartment, the same apartment I'd lived in for 8 years, but which felt different now. The furniture was the same, the walls were the same, but I was different. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer someone whose value depended on what I could do for other people. I was Margaret Sullivan, Director of Community Nutrition Programs, teacher, advocate, a woman whose opinion mattered and whose experience had value. I made myself dinner, a simple pasta dish with vegetables from the farmer's market, and ate it at my small kitchen table. As I ate, I thought about all the meals I'd prepared over the years, all the people I'd fed, all the invisible acts of love that had sustained others while leaving me empty. But this meal was different. This meal was for me, prepared by me, enjoyed by me. It was nourishment in every sense of the word, food for my body and sustenance for my soul. After dinner, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and opened a book. It was a cookbook, but not the kind I'd used in Richard's kitchen. This one was about community cooking, about using food to build connections and foster understanding between people from different backgrounds. As I read, I thought about the future, about the second community nutrition center we were planning to open next year, about the cookbook I was writing, filled not with fancy recipes for expensive ingredients, but with simple, nourishing meals that could feed families on tight budgets, about the cooking classes I would teach, the people I would train, the small part I would play in making sure fewer families went to bed hungry. I thought about Richard, too, spending his nights in a federal prison, probably wondering how his life had gone so wrong. Part of me felt sorry for him, for the loneliness that had driven him to value money and status above genuine human connection. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that his crimes had been discovered before more people were hurt. Grateful that I'd found the courage to do the right thing even when it was difficult. Grateful that his downfall had led to my rise. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Mrs. Chen. "Margaret, I hope I'm not calling too late. I just heard back from the city council about our proposal for the third community center." "And?" "They approved it. Full funding, that beautiful space in Humboldt Park we looked at. You'll be able to serve 3 neighborhoods now, reach hundreds more families." 3 community centers, hundreds more families. When I'd been standing in Richard's kitchen a year ago, recording his confessions for the FBI, I never could have imagined this future. I never could have seen past the immediate crisis to the possibilities that lay on the other side. "Margaret, are you there?" "Yes," I said, smiling. "Yes, I'm here. That's wonderful news. There's something else. The Chicago Tribune wants to do a feature story about our program, about you specifically, about your journey from working in someone's kitchen to directing a program that's changing lives across the city. A feature story, in the newspaper, about me. They want to interview you next week. Would you be interested? Interested in telling my story? In talking about the invisible women who keep the world running, who cook and clean and care for others while remaining unseen themselves? In discussing the importance of feeding people with dignity, of recognizing that everyone deserves not just food but respect? "Yes," I said, "I'd be very interested." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, thinking about the girl I'd been so many years ago. Poor, scared, convinced that the best she could hope for was to serve others well enough that they might keep her around. That girl could never have imagined sitting in her own apartment, in her own life, planning programs that would help hundreds of families, preparing to be interviewed by a major newspaper about work that mattered. But maybe she'd always been there, that girl with bigger dreams. Maybe she'd just been buried under years of being told she wasn't worth much, years of accepting invisibility as the price of safety. Maybe it had taken 63 years and a crisis of conscience to dig her out, but she'd been there all along. I finished my tea and got ready for bed, moving through the familiar routines of my evening. But as I brushed my teeth, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw something I hadn't seen in years. I saw someone who mattered, someone whose life had value beyond the service she could provide to others, someone who'd found the courage to do the right thing even when it was difficult, someone who'd taken a lifetime of invisible work and transformed it into visible change. I saw Margaret Sullivan, and for the first time in years, I liked what I was looking at. The next morning, I woke up early and made myself coffee, not because someone else needed it, but because I wanted it. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the sun rise over Chicago, thinking about the day ahead, a meeting with the architecture firm designing our third community center, a conference call with potential corporate sponsors, a cooking class I would teach that afternoon to a group of teenagers learning job skills, all of it meaningful, all of it mine. As I finished my coffee, I thought about something Katherine Henderson had said at the auxiliary meeting. She'd called me extraordinary, but I wasn't sure that was true. I wasn't extraordinary for doing the right thing when I learned about Richard's crimes. I wasn't extraordinary for caring about hungry families or for wanting to use my skills to help others. What I was, I thought, was finally visible. Finally seen for who I'd always been underneath the invisibility that poverty and service had wrapped around me like a cloak. I was a woman who cooked with love, who understood that food was about more than nutrition, who knew that everyone deserved to be fed with dignity and respect. I was someone who'd survived being discarded and overlooked, who'd found the strength to start over at an age when most people were thinking about winding down. I was extraordinary only in the sense that every person is extraordinary when they're finally seen for who they really are. As I got dressed for work, I thought about the question Katherine had asked me that day at the auxiliary meeting, the question that had started this entire journey. Have you cooked for someone who never said thank you? The answer was yes. I'd cooked for many people who never said thank you. I'd served and cleaned and cared for people who saw me as part of the furniture, as invisible as the air they breathed. But now I was cooking for myself. Now I was feeding people who thanked me not just for the food, but for the respect with which I served it. Now I was using my hands and my knowledge and my experience to nourish communities instead of just individual appetites. Now, finally, I was visible. And that, I thought as I headed out into the Chicago morning, was worth everything I'd gone through to get here. So let me ask you, have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you? Have you ever felt invisible while making someone else's life beautiful? Tell me in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who has poured her soul into service without recognition. For more stories that celebrate the strength of invisible women, click on the podcast link to your left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. We'll see you in our next story.